Good evening and welcome to the Wednesday, August 12th, 2015 meeting of the Planning Board of Raymond. The board does not have a quorum this evening, and we will be working on proposed ordinance revisions for the 2016 town meeting. Without a quorum, there'll be no votes this evening, but we are going to proceed with the discussion of the possible recommendations for ordinance work, and schedule the rest of it for our next scheduled meeting. So, working right off of the ordinance topics, the first one is resource protection and zoning map changes. So, you're up.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Giles. I'm with Technics. We've been contracted by the town to provide GIS and mapping services.
John, you want to grab the mic?
Right.
Is that mic on, Dominic?
Okay. Evening. My name is John Giles. I'm with Technics. We've been hired by the town to provide GIS services and mapping services, and I'm here tonight to talk about a few of the possible edits we found that may be warranted on the zoning map, specifically with the RP zones and some of the shoreline zones. I brought some maps tonight to point out some of the changes. That the best thing might be to bring the table up to the front, and then we can all kind of look at the maps, and I can point out some of the changes we're looking at.
Where would it get on the?
What's that?
Will you be able to get it onto the?
I think so. I have a pretty much a shot of that. Unless wherever you move it, I'll move it to it.
All right.
If you need to stand anything up, did you want that or?
Yeah, I don't have a board to put them on necessarily, so.
Good point.
So basically, this is a 2-year-old zoning map that we have. The only change that was made last year was
I can see it.
Panther Run now has a 600-foot shoreline buffer on it at the request of the state because it qualifies as a river. Prior to that, it did not have that on. It was just a stream protection buffer.
Correct.
But so this is generally what the map looks like now. And one of the things we were asked to do last year was to look at.
Can I ask you a favor? I'm sorry. Can I have you get on the other side because I'm going to be getting it from that camera? Just, I mean, that way I can capture it.
So what we were asked to look at last year was to look at the existing zoning map and figure out how the RP zones were arrived at, and what are they composed of, and does the town have any flexibility or latitude in perhaps editing those or changing those to reflect more accurate or more reality-based information.
Okay.
And to generally, how were they arrived at? So what we've done in the last year, the other thing was we were waiting for some LiDAR data, which is elevation mapping data the state was developing, to be publicly published. And that's been published now, we've started using it, so that's also going to help us with this task. So what we started doing recently, after we finished up the tax map edits, is started looking at how were the RP zones created. And RP zones on a shoreline zoning map generally are composed of areas that of natural resources that you want protected, that fall within the shore zone. And in Raymond's case, there was some discussion about, are there some areas that we could remove now, because there was this comment made that the state was now not requiring certain things to be an RP zone that they did in the past. And basically what I was able to find out is that seems to be a change that resulted between the 2006 Chapter 1000, which is the shoreline zoning statute. Chapter 1000's guidelines in 2006 required certain habitat data to be included as an RP zone, and in the 2015 guidelines for Chapter 1000, it's no longer required, it's optional. So basically, the habitat data that's in question here is the inland wading and waterfowl habitat, or IWWH data. And that data is available for Raymond. We've looked at it, and the majority of the IWWH data in Raymond actually coincides with actual wetlands. So I'm not sure we can actually remove it from the map, the habitat data areas, because they would still be wetlands anyways.
Okay.
So then we started looking at, okay, well, how accurate is the map in the RP zone? What might be editable, and the town does have the ability to edit the map from time to time. It has to be approved by, I believe, the voters of the town at town meeting, but we can make edits to the map. So we started to do was looking at the existing map and started looking at the individual RP zoned areas to see how accurate those wetland areas were. How were they composed? In some cases, you can see there's a lighter green here with a red outline, and then there's a darker green. The darker green's the existing RP zones, and the lighter green with the red outline are what we've mapped as the new wetland, or are the actual wetlands.
The lighter green is the actual wetland?
Yeah, that
Okay.
we're finding in color infrared aerial photography and with LiDAR data. So with color infrared imagery, we can tell the difference between wet soil and dry soil, wetland vegetation and upland vegetation. And we can also tell the difference of general vegetative character. With the LiDAR data, we can see what the elevations are. So if we combine the two, we can find areas where it looks like it's visually, it's wetland. The vegetation is clearly different. It looks like the soil's wet to some degree. And then we look at the elevation, and if it's basically a flat area, it's not going up a hillside or a slope. It's generally flat. It's hemmed in by some slopes around it. That's generally indicative of a wet area.
Okay.
So what we were finding were some of the wetland areas actually, as drawn in the original state data that was in the current town zoning map, shoreline zoning map, some of those wetland areas actually were going up hillsides. So what we're able to do is pull those lines back down to where it's more realistically the edge of the wetland.
Okay.
So, as a consequence in doing that, we did find a few more wetlands that weren't on the map originally, but we also in some cases found some that had to be reshaped quite a bit. So there's a little gain and a loss there.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, it will be more reflective of reality. And this is based on data the state is providing, and I believe it's based on methods that the state would approve of once we get them to look at the results of the map in a draft fashion.
Okay.
The other thing we started looking at was how.
Jim, let me just interrupt for a second.
Sure.
Chris, but in actuality, we would use what's on the ground.
The map
for-
always has that disclaimer that
Yeah.
the map is a guide to what
What's on the ground.
is on
Okay.
the ground,
Yep.
and then what is on the ground is what a wetland delineus would map and use
For their
for the
okay.
delineation of wetlands.
Okay.
So-
Those resource protection zones are existing now?
Yes. Yeah, for the most part.
Not all of them.
There's a few extra.
Are they, are they on our map, our
No, this.
shoreline zone
If you
map?
look at the two,
I just don't remember.
no,
So-
and I wouldn't either, Greg. I mean, there's
So this
a
is
lot
the
of
existing map.
Okay.
So you'll notice this sort of amoeba shaped shape here is here. So like here's a new one.
And
that-
these
that-
were all yeah. the state,
Yeah.
that's a new one. And these were all generated by the state of Maine.
So the way this data got created, the original wetland data here that you see on the current map was created in the 70s using Landsat and USGS topo quads, which are a 1 to 24,000 scale. They're about 1 inch equals 2,000 feet to the inch. 2,000 feet to the inch. They were done hard copy, and then in the late 80s, early 90s, the state and federal agencies took those hard copy maps and started digitally tracing them to create this data here. The scale of Landsat data typically, so it was images. Landsat created images. Each image pixel, the little dots in the image, was like 90 feet across. It was good for its time, but the resolution is nowhere near what we should be using nowadays.
Right.
So.
Well, I asked that for a reason,
Sure.
because resource protection zones aren't applied unless they're in a shoreline zone.
Right.
And those may not be in shoreline zones.
Well, they're in Raymond's shore.
Yeah,
Raymond's-
but would the state have mapped that for us, even though we were not following the same rules as the state?
Well, the
Maybe
data
I don't
that
need to know this, but I'm
yeah, well,
curious.
no, but you know, I'd be happy to I guess give the history of it. The data that is being used, you know, the map wetlands traditionally up to this point is National Wetlands Inventory Data, or NWI, and the state and the feds have mapped that not just in the shore zones, but
Everywhere.
for everywhere. Yeah. So, you know, what we're attempting to do here is take the newer data, the better data that's more reflective of reality of what you're actually going to find on the ground, and attempt to use that to delineate these RP zones so that we can get a better idea of what's really out there. At the end of the day, like Chris says, it's really the on-the-ground,
Right.
you know,
It's
wetland
not really
delineation
changing anything.
No, we're going to make the map a little more accurate, a little more illustrative of what's out there, which gives everyone, both the residents of the town, developers, private landowners, and town staff, a little more accurate and better heads up of what they may encounter, so that, you know, projects don't encounter a hurdle at the 11th hour all of a sudden. But, so we've done that. I've also looked at, you know, what does the town have in terms of latitude or flexibility, and what can be on the map or what can be taken off the map? What do they have to put on the map by the Chapter 1000 guidelines the state has put into the statute, and what's sort of in the town's purview.
Right.
And so, one of the big changes the town could do is to remove the IWWH habitat data if it wasn't coincident with a wetland. Unfortunately, in Raymond's case, most of the IWWH habitat data is coincident with a wetland.
Which would make sense.
Right. The other area that we do have some latitude on is that we can take other data and refine the maps to make them more accurate, and in some cases remove areas that are, you know, said to be in an RP zone or next to an RP zone on the current map, but when we start looking at the more accurate data, actually aren't.
Mm-hmm.
So that again is one of the areas of latitude or flexibility the town has in terms of mapping these RP zones and documenting them.
But really wouldn't change much.
It really wouldn't, no. The biggest change, one of the things we found with the current map is, I don't think the original mapping that was done did not show the flood zones. And under Chapter 1000 and the town's ordinances, an RP zone can also be it also can be composed of a 100-year floodplain that falls within the shore zone. So what you see here in red along the shores of the ponds and the lakes are FEMA floodplain, 100-year floodplains, or A zones, that would appear to be significant enough that they may need to be made an RP zone.
And this is from FEMA data?
This is from FEMA data.
Wow, okay.
I think what happened originally when the RP zones were put on the map was that they were not, they did not use the FEMA data and to see if there's an RP zone. Now, there's a fair bit of red here, but one other area where the town has some flexibility, and I've got to get some guidance from DEP on this, is there's this language in the language that defines what's an RP zone that says basically if it's a developed piece of land or shore, you don't have to put it into an RP zone. But what is the definition of developed? Is it a lawn? Is it a, you know, if somebody puts in a vegetative buffer for erosion control along the shore, is that considered developed at that point, or is that considered something you'd want to keep in an RP zone? I have a feeling with some of these shorelines, they may be developed enough, even though it looks like we may be putting some more RP zones here and there throughout the shoreline zone. When you look at what is developed and what's not, it may be much more mitigated than it would appear here.
And what are you've changed kind of purples now?
So the darker purple is the existing shore zone.
Right.
The lighter purple here is simply the 600-foot buffer from the shoreline.
Okay.
We tried to make the two colors somewhat similar so it didn't really distract from it, but it gives you a sense of where the 600-foot shoreline zone is, both here as well as around some of these other water bodies, to get a sense of where some of these RP zones that we're talking, potential RP zones we're talking about, are where they lie.
Okay.
Now with the LiDAR data, and we've done this in other communities, we can use that to actually take the FEMA mapping. The FEMA mapping's a little inaccurate. What it's good at doing is telling you what the flood elevation is. What it's not great at doing is telling you where the edge of that floodplain is, because they used USGS quad sheet data originally, had 10 or 20 foot contours on it, that just, it's not accurate enough to put that horizontal location of the floodplain line down on the face of the earth. So typically when someone's doing a development, again, it goes back to where's that elevation on the ground. Well, with LiDAR data, which is accurate to about 6 inches vertically, we can put that line down on the map much more accurately.
Okay.
So what I'm suggesting we do going forward is actually start looking at mapping the flood line around the shores of these water bodies and actually see just how much of an A zone really is there in the shore zone.
Okay.
The other thing we've looked at is the water level in Sebago, with considering the dam regulation document, and we've gone and actually mapped what the high water is based on that regulation document and what the low water is. So we're taking that into consideration as we're doing some of this mapping. Some of the changes that we've found, hold on a second again. So in the case of this wetland, between Crescent and Raymond Pond, you can see the red outline here. The darker green is the existing wetland, and we found that wetland actually is shifted over this way a bit and isn't quite where the original mapping shows it to be. We did check a lot of the stream protection buffers also to make sure if they were complete and mapped as Chapter 1000 guidelines indicate they should be, and they generally were. So that's, in a couple cases, I think we had to extend the upper reaches of the stream a couple hundred feet, maybe less than 1,000 feet, but primarily the stream protection buffers were fine. I think the biggest issue is with probably RP zones and these FEMA 100-year floodplains. And then we've also, again, tried to refine the wetland mapping as much as possible to make it more reflective of what's actually out there. We've gone through anything that was visible in the aerial photography that looked like a wetland, we map it, and if there's a certain size threshold, 2 acres and greater generally would fall into either shoreline zoning or an RP zone, and anything smaller than 2 acres, the town has the option of ignoring at this point. So.
Okay.
So that's where we are right now.
On the flood data that you're putting on there.
Yep.
Right. That the only thing that we would do would be less than what FEMA is. My question is, when we do this and publish it, are we going to be now requiring homes to have flood insurance that would not necessarily have?
No.
Okay.
All we're doing is we're taking their data, the FEMA data,
right.
and interpreting it to create the RP zone. It's not creating a floodplain.
Okay.
One thing we have done in other communities, we've actually gone through a process with FEMA, and we've helped make the floodplain maps more accurate. sometimes removing structures from the floodplain, other times finding structures that were in the floodplain that the FEMA mapping didn't show. But that's a totally separate process,
Okay.
and this should not trigger anything.
Okay.
No.
All right.
You know, we've talked to some communities, because there's new floodplain maps in the offing at some point when FEMA gets back to holding that public hearing process. We have talked to some communities about using the LiDAR data to refine that, because what we are finding in inland Cumberland County, that FEMA basically copied the old maps. They really didn't do any new studies, so they didn't redelineate any of the floodplains to any great degree.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right.
Any questions? Any concerns?
Looks all good to me. Right? We're not really changing. We're just refining. I don't see any big issues
No.
that it's going to cause.
You know, the lines are shifting here and there a little bit. I mean, there are, I'll be honest, there'll probably gonna be some winners and some losers in that sense, but not any more than would be found if somebody went out and went through a development review process or did a site plan process, so.
Yep. Chris, do you see any problems?
No, I think it'll be the maps will be much better to use as a reference. If they're more accurate, I think the town is gonna benefit.
All right.
And one thing, you know, I've seen other towns do when we get the maps to this level is they're able to use it in the office to reduce perhaps field visits.
Mm-hmm.
There's a certain level of field investigation that can be done from the office before someone goes out, making the whole process a little more efficient, so.
Okay. Sheila, do you have any questions?
No, it's perfectly clear to me.
Holy
Don't
mackerel.
show
All
them
right.
clear as mud.
You're just improving accuracy.
Yes.
is what
Trying,
you're doing.
yes.
Yep.
It's the reality on the ground, it's.
I think whenever we can do that, it's a plus.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Great job.
okay.
Thanks, John. So I think we
Thank
just,
you.
that can just package up and go forward. Whatever language we need to, it's a pretty short language to change to get the map into the warrant.
All right, moving on, I didn't.
Do we need to do any ordinance change other than to do a map change?
Just a map change.
Yeah, I don't
It's
think
just-
there's
I
anything.
think it's
in
just
the-
a map change,
Yeah,
right.
but I mean,
Yeah.
you still have to have it
You put it in
written
a
up
warrant.
as
Yeah.
a warrant.
Yeah.
I guess the biggest ordinance change there may be is under the current ordinance, Raymond has opted, I think because this was the guidelines for chapter 1000 at the time, to include the IWWH habitat data as automatically as an RP zone in Raymond. Now the state's saying communities can opt to do that if
Right.
they want to. It's not mandatory, but to change it in Raymond really wouldn't affect anything.
Yeah.
So John, from this point forward, you'll refine those and come back to another meeting and we'll go through that with the board in more detail, and then you will work with staff and.
Yeah. I think probably work with staff and then present a final draft to the planning board for I think you guys approve it before it goes to town meeting, if I'm not
Correct.
mistaken.
Yeah.
They make recommendations.
Recommendation.
Yeah. Okay.
We send it with a recommendation
Yeah.
to the selectmen.
So we
Right.
could get that finalized and present that to you and work with staff in between.
Yeah, we have to have that 30-day window for public comment.
Okay.
So Danielle kind of gives those
So
dates.
right now,
and I
you
don't know
can't,
if-
as a board, give him or give us direction, or can you?
Well, I think we can give you direction if you listen.
I mean, in some of this mapping, we're already doing as part of the tax parcel mapping.
Right.
So,
I don't see any reason why we can't move ahead with it, and I doubt very much Ben or Bruce would have any problems.
and if somebody, you know, if Bruce or Ben would like to talk about it, you know, at another time convenient to them, I'm just over in Gray, I'd be happy to come by.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Whoops.
All right, DEP next. You gonna do that, Chris?
No, it's gonna be Stephanie.
Stephanie. All right.
And I'll
You'll just
I'll
chime
be
in?
right
He's
here.
gonna help though.
I'll help.
All right, so do you have the memo?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll be honest, I did not read this whole chapter 1000.
Well, I'll explain it to you.
In detail?
No.
Okay.
I've read it, but not this very.
So, okay, so essentially the big issue here is expansion of non-conforming structures. and you may have already heard, but basically, they're going to a tiered expansion. So, I've kinda, I can walk through, the basics. There are a couple other issues besides that, that they're addressing, so I'll just go through them one by one through the memo. And the first one,
Stephanie, before you start, how,
do we wanna talk about, deadlines and that type of thing?
no, I kinda wanna talk about how involved the changes, the impact of the changes, and whether or not, it's even going to be productive to go through detailed with just Greg and I here on this.
I
What's
think
your-
it's productive to just kind of summarize it, just for the, in case anybody's watching, the
Yeah.
public, and since I'm here, we
Yeah,
might
that's
as
right.
well.
Bruce and Ben?
If you were here.
And I
Okay.
can, and
All right,
it's
that's
pretty,
fine.
it's pretty simple,
Okay,
actually.
and
I
that
think
simple's
it'll be-
good. Go ahead, I'm sorry, it's,
No, it's all right. So essentially, I've kind of listed, there's a lot of definition changes, but most of these changes are directly related to one of the few larger changes. They're just to keep the definitions consistent with the suggested, the other suggested changes. So the big one, like I said, is non-conforming structures, and they've gone to a tiered, instead of dealing with looking at a non-conforming structure and looking at expansion in terms of volume, they're basically changing that to allow a percentage or a footprint increase. So if you are within a 25-foot buffer or less, and your entire structure is within that, then you have the expansion capability to expand 800 square feet or 30% of your structure. If your structure straddles the line between 25 and more than 25, then you can still do that, but you have to keep that expansion beyond the 25-foot buffer.
Okay.
You can interject if I'm not
So-
getting any of this right.
Yeah.
I'll help, I'm gonna help out with one thing. So if your structure is totally within the 25 feet, there's a height limitation as well
Yeah.
as the 800 square foot or the 30% expansion
So you
of the
can't- okay.
footprint. In the definitions, when it talks about footprint, now they're looking at a bird's eye view, looking down on the building. We
All
used
right.
to look at square foot by your floor levels
Yep.
and your decks. That's all was square footage. And then we looked at the volume of the structure. Now the volume goes away, then it's strictly square footage and then a height allowance of 15 feet or the height of the existing structure. It can't exceed the existing structure's height or 15 feet. So it's gonna have this tiered effect going up from the lake instead of having a 35-foot building right at the edge of the lake,
Mhm.
which you've heard at some meetings, maybe the appeals board meetings, more than planning board, of the walling in effect of the lake.
Right.
I think that was to address it, so.
Yeah, the concept is a graduated kind of tiered structure, so the farther you get, the more flexibility you might have to expand the structure. That's it, in essence. Beyond that, they've also given the option for communities to make some exemptions for height, like cupolas and domes and widows' walks. Those types of things can be exempt from the height limits. There's some issues with non-vegetated surfaces. Basically, there are some exceptions now. You no longer have to include ledge or outcroppings or public boat launches as part of that percentage. Let's see. There's a limitation. This actually might be relevant to some of the work that we did last year on boat launches. There's a limitation of 1 per lot. I can't remember what language we used last year, but I think that came up. I'm not sure what direction we went. I have to look at that. No houseboats. Every structure on the water, if it's a houseboat, it actually has to be a usable watercraft. And there's some shoreland stabilization projects in terms of vegetation, removal of vegetation. Allows for a access way of 12 feet. It has to be restored after the project's complete. Deck and revitalization. Decks are allowed in areas where it's like in the process of a revitalization project. Campsites, there's some dimensional minimum dimensional regulations associated with that. And there's some additional changes with the timber harvesting regulations in terms of increasing culvert sizes. Minor edits have been made to the standards relating to the clearing of vegetation and storm damaged or dead trees. And finally, just make sure I'm not skipping anything. Communities that wish to require excavation contractors to be licensed, you can put that language in. And there's also some language related to ADA issues that allow the CEO to authorize a variance to an owner of a residence to make the dwelling more accessible for somebody with a disability who resides regularly in the dwelling. That's essentially it. And I have started making some of the edits. I've been working with Mike and Chris, Mike Morrison with DEP and Chris. They're fairly straightforward, so I thought for the next meeting I would present those changes to the board so they could actually go through them and see them in the ordinance and evaluate them that way.
What does have you had the table 1 on 14?
Yeah.
Does that change any of what we have in our ordinance as far as who reviews and who approves?
No.
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
But your original question was, how is this going to affect
Yep.
property owners or landowners in the shoreline zone?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be, just like with John's presentation, there's going to be winners and losers.
Right.
Some accessory structures in the shoreline zone may not to be expanded if the principal structure is, say, at 75 feet, and you've got like a guest house 25 feet from the water, you won't be able to do an expansion to that guest house.
Okay.
And today, you could expand each structure by 30% of either the volume or the square footage, whichever is greater. So some people are going to lose, but I think the majority of people will be able to do more.
And this is the ordinance that we've talked about and been waiting on?
Yes.
This is
We
the
were
one?
waiting on
Okay.
guidance from the DEP, and what I think Stephanie would agree, I think this is going to be a mandatory change.
Yeah.
But
They
we
just
don't
haven't
know
assigned a
what the
deadline.
deadline is going to
Right.
be. That could come out next month and be June of 2016. We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So mandatory change in that we have the option of making it stricter, but not
Less.
not less.
Correct.
Right.
Okay.
That's always the case.
Right.
Yeah, and usually they assign a deadline to these types of changes, and it is kind of odd that they haven't at this point, but several of the other communities in our jurisdiction have already started to make the amendments, so I think it is expected that at some point that may happen. It just hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
And communities that I deal with, that I know the code enforcement officers in towns that have adopted this, the code enforcement officers like it and the public likes it.
Okay.
So if that's of interest, that's
Well,
what I'm hearing.
It's probably worth mentioning, I mean, when we were talking about the issue of volume and trying to calculate volume in some structures and how that can get more complicated and more difficult for the public. This is certainly a more straightforward method to calculate that.
I have a question. Under the timber harvesting thing, you've got the cross-sectional area at least equal to something times
3,
3. It must
that
be
should be 3.5
typo.
times. Sorry.
It's 3.5.
Yeah, I found a couple times.
Yeah, I think
Oh, that's a typo.
it
for
was
that.
3, I believe.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's increased.
I was just curious.
Can I just ask a question? Is it the normal course of events that the plan board is more or less restrictive when you have exemption options, just in general?
Well, it can't be less, but as a rule, the community has been more restrictive,
Except for me.
except for Greg, right? Except for Greg. So going forward, I think, Chris, probably, is this yours document?
That was some stuff that I added. It's stuff that I got at a training from the DEP.
Okay.
I just thought it'd be helpful you to look at the tier.
Yeah, it was, and I think maybe even more, even a shorter version for when we finally get to public hearing that we can kind of try to explain
Absolutely.
what the impact would be able to help.
Yep.
Keep it. All right. So I think investment study is pretty straightforward. You're right. We're just gonna, next meeting, we'll go through the changes.
Okay.
Who wants? Right, you,
I'm all set.
all right.
Amazing.
Housekeeping changes by the fire protection ordinance. All right.
Maine's Raymond Fire Inspector. I'm not sure, did she include the whole memo, or?
I
think
think the
so.
whole memo's in there, David.
6 pages.
6 pages.
There we go.
Not the
Okay.
ordinance, it's just parts
We'll
of
give you a page tonight, David.
Just a page?
Yeah, no. Pick the best one.
Well, all right, give me a second. Most of these are administrative
Yep.
changes. Right out of the gate, number one is just making some changes to the language that adopts the life safety code in the fire protection ordinance. Current language adopts the most current edition, which is not something that is actually even enforceable, because, you know, the same process that you're going through tonight, you know, the state comes out with or the NFPA comes out with a new version, there needs to be an understanding of what the changes are before we can even enforce it. So
All right.
it's just changing that. And then the last portion of that is there are other portions of the ordinance that require single-family homes to comply with that portion of it, and this paragraph conflicts with that because it states that, you know, the ordinance applies to everything other than single-family homes. So. Number 2 was just an administrative, the business address for the fire department has been 1443 Roosevelt Trail since the new fire station was built about 10 years ago.
Your mail still
More.
being forwarded?
What's that?
Mail still being forwarded?
Mail is still being
Good,
forwarded,
all right,
but we'd like to just change that. Number 3 is requiring, this is adding a requirement for a permit for a fire alarm system for any installation or modification to an existing fire alarm system. Currently, the ordinance requires a permit from the fire department for sprinkler systems, but not for fire alarm systems. And what we're finding is there are a number of fire alarm systems that are installed that are not compliant with local ordinance and with state regulations.
So this is basically commercial?
This would be basically commercial. This would be commercial, yes.
Commercial, okay.
And to the comment that I made earlier, the way the ordinance is written right now, and we're not looking to change that, is that the ordinance applies to basically everything but 1 and 2 family homes. There are certain instances where 1 and 2 family homes have regulations apply, but they're specifically spelled out within the ordinance. So any of the general requirements are primarily commercial in nature, commercial or multifamily residential apartment buildings or something like that. The next one is, again, just some administrative things, picking up the fact that the state doesn't use BOCA anymore, and some language there. I won't go into detail on any of these, but if there's any questions on any of these, please stop me. The next one is the other addition that we're asking to make. Currently, the language that we're looking to add to Article 6, Section 2 is to require, currently the ordinance requires a permit before the use of or installation of a solid fuel burning device, a wood stove or a pellet stove or anything like that. What this paragraph would do would add to that requirement that a permit shall not be issued unless smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors are installed in the home. And this goes back to what I've mentioned a couple of times. The ordinance doesn't necessarily speak directly to single, 1 and 2 family homes. The current state, state statute for smoke detectors only applies to homes built after January of 1982, or after a transfer of ownership after 2009, I believe. And carbon monoxide detectors are only required in homes built after 2012. So there are a number of residences in the town of Raymond that could legally have a wood stove installed and issued a permit, but not be legally required to have smoke detectors. Adding a wood burning or a pellet stove to the house significantly increases the potential for fire in that home, and this is an attempt to protect those properties and the families that are living in them.
So in this case, are the smoke detector that you buy at Home Depot and put up on the wall, that satisfies the requirement?
Yep.
Okay.
And for the most part, I will say, for the most part, when this is always a recommendation that we make when we do the inspection and issue a permit, and for the most part, I can't cite you a situation where someone's refused to do that, but there have been a number where there hasn't been one, and we've said you should put it in. There's been agreement, and we don't have the resource or the staff to send back out and double check on a lot of these things. So having the requirement in there allows us to put it in the document. That way, if it in the permit as a permit requirement, similar to a condition that Chris would put on a building permit.
Okay.
So somebody who voluntarily says they'll put it in, you don't have faith that they'll take care of that?
I do, no, that's what I've done, no, I do. That's everybody that we've asked to put them in has agreed to put them in. But
then why would you need this then?
Because it's a hole in the state statute, because the way the statute is written is not a blanket requirement. And I'm not asking to have this be a blanket requirement for the town. If someone decides to install a wood stove in their home,
Understand that.
they should have be required to have smoke detector and
I was
carbon monoxide
opposed to the
detectors.
requirement of a permit to do that anyway, and I will remain consistent.
What's that?
I said I was opposed to the requirement.
To the requirement for the permit?
The solid fuel, and I'll remain consistent.
Okay.
I put more faith in people than I do government, so. Anyway, I said my piece, keep going.
Number 6, there's just a administrative, it's a typo in the ordinance. There are actually 2 Article 6s, so a number of the remaining points are just renumbering the articles in the ordinance.
Okay.
Number 7, Article 7, Section 5, Paragraph A, we're asking that this just be changed to add the underscored language to read that a single-family dwelling, unless specifically included by the ordinance or state law. The paragraph excludes a single-family home from the definition of a building, which is applicable to the ordinance. And again, this is just trying to be consistent throughout the ordinance, so that where we do require specific requirements in a single-family home for very specific reasons, or in the case of the solid fuel permit, it gives us the jurisdiction without conflict to enforce those requirements.
That's a pretty significant change, though, isn't it?
No, because it's without the added language, single-family homes are by definition excluded from the ordinance.
Right.
Which is in direct conflict with the requirement for anybody installing a wood stove in a single-family home to get a permit and have the fire department inspect that.
But would not this language then start to include all the other requirements that are being required? And
No,
put that onto the single-family home?
I understand what you're saying. I think in the larger context of what section 5 is talking about, what section 5 is doing is defining what the ordinance is applicable to. And section 5, paragraph A, the preceding paragraph of the ordinance basically says, except for the following. And so all this is doing is as opposed to saying that this ordinance applies to all buildings except single-family homes.
Right.
It's going to say all buildings except single-family homes unless specifically listed in this ordinance.
All right.
So that that one probably needs a little more context of the whole section.
Yes.
I had the same
Yeah.
thoughts.
Yeah. No. The intent is with all there's 3 of these sections where I'm just trying to clarify a conflict.
Yep.
In the exclusion of single-family homes. I'm not adding any additional requirements for single-family homes. We've already got requirements in place for single-family homes. I see in the enforcement of the ordinance that there's a conflict inherent in the document the way it's written. So, and that's the only purpose for all 3 of these changes relative to single-family homes.
Okey-doke.
I'm not going to go through 8, 9. All right, number 10 is some duplication in language. Number 11 is administrative. Number 12, again, there's some repeated language, and it's not repeated. The intent is the same in both paragraphs, but it's said a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
So this is just an attempt to consolidate it all and say it once and say it right and say it in one place. So again, the intent here is not to change any of the requirements, but just to eliminate some of the conflicts in the language of the ordinance, the way it's currently written.
But now with Article 12, number 12 here.
Yep.
In your explanation, it says the intent of both paragraphs requirement that if an existing building is added to, and could that existing building be a single-family home?
No, because that would be this article is for new construction, and that only falls under commercial. So the fire department,
But you're increasing. It says isn't it exceeds 25% of the area and or volume of the existing building?
correct. But the fire department does not have jurisdiction over the expansion of single-family homes. That's the code enforcement officers. So this Article 9 does not apply to single-family homes. It applies to back to that other.
And if we had the whole Article 9, that would be obvious?
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah. So and then the next is just making this change. Number 15 is, it currently reads that a liquor license shall not be granted without full compliance with the fire code. The intent of that is that it is with full compliance with this code. The fire code actually technically is in reference to NFPA 1, which is the state's fire code, which is outside of the local jurisdiction. And then
Just out of curiosity, is the liquor license singled out for any particular reason?
Because a liquor, the requirement is that a liquor license cannot be issued until an inspection, a life safety inspection has been done on the property. So that.
And
they go hand
is
in
that
hand.
different from another commercial building, let's say a restaurant, or that doesn't have a liquor license, or a grocery store?
Only that once they're, not in terms of their initial issuance, but only that a liquor license is renewable every year. So before you can renew your liquor license, you're required to have life safety inspection.
And the selectmen will not issue the license if there are any outstanding life safety violations.
No,
If it's just
curious.
maintenance type stuff, they'll do it.
Right.
But if it's a life safety issue, they won't issue the permit.
Okay.
And then the last three are, again, just changing, just continuing the article number changes. That's the list. Is there any questions?
No, David, I think it's pretty straightforward. There's no real additional requirements, you're just really just cleaning up the
Yeah, I
language.
think the only additional language that we're requesting is the article on smoke, requiring smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors before a solid fuel burning permit will be issued.
And then I think just that number, is it the number 12 wording there? What was the one we needed to, well, yeah, I'm sure you took notes.
5.
5.
Article 4.
Now, Article 5 is the addition, what was the one we said, just the
Oh,
end
yeah,
language?
in the
clean up a
permit,
little bit?
the number 3 was
Oh, I'm
Article
sorry.
5 to require a permit. And
Yeah.
that's, that's just, again, that's, the reasoning for that is to make it consistent with the existing requirement for a permit for a sprinkler system. The ordinance requires that any commercial property with 1,000 square feet or more of floor area have a monitored fire alarm system. But there's no requirement for, the requirement is to install a system, but there's no requirement for a permit. So there's no formal plan review process, there's no, pre-approval. We have found a number of, businesses in town that have non-compliant systems installed. So it's an attempt to, it's an attempt to try to get out in front of it so that somebody doesn't install it or make modifications that then once we do the inspection, we find out are not compliant.
Right.
And try to work with them before they actually have a contractor in the building moving wiring or installing a system.
Okay, I don't see any.
I'm all set.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think we're good, David. So who's gonna turn this eventually into language? Are you gonna do that? Are we going
It
to-
depends on the issue. Some of these will be done by the town planner and staff, and some will be done by Stephanie, and then everything I think you review at the end before it goes to the planning board. Am I right?
Yeah, usually I review the warrant.
She reviews once it's in warrant form.
Yeah.
And when do we get Mary involved at some point, or just?
The
She
town-
reviews the warrant
After-
Exactly.
after Danielle and I go through it. It goes to Mary.
All right.
So there's a little, some of the expertise comes from the planner, some comes from Stephanie, some comes from staff. We all work to the same goal.
Okay.
Get the warrants in warrant form and get them to you, and the town attorney will review those as well.
So David, I'd ask you then, when we eventually get to the public hearing to review the proposed warrant, if you would kind of put that on your schedule so you could answer those questions.
Yep.
All right. Stormwater.
Okay, these were the result of us working with the phosphorus standards in the land use ordinance, and the difficulty we were having applying those standards to smaller projects where it gives us the ability to use the point system.
Yep.
And Jim went through, made some changes. Some of them are to clarify
The redder of the changes?
the red of the changes. I don't know if you want me to go through them all, but basically this would allow us, these changes would allow us to use this for a backlot driveway. We found that there were certain points in there that were geared more to a single-family home or an office building or something like that, where you could use the point system. But when we came down to backlot driveways, private road extensions, it just didn't give us the ability to use the point system. So we've been directing people to do rain gardens and things that aren't actually in the language. So Jim cleaned up the reviewing authorities, who has the authority to do them, that's the first part, added some language to make these more specific, and then actually when you get into the point system, it talks about points given for certain infiltration systems, wet pond designs, stuff like that.
Do you think the point system is working?
it will work better with these changes. It's working, but it's a little cumbersome, and we've had to make some staff decisions on what the intent of the ordinance was and make some judgments. This will take a lot of that judgment out and make it easier for an applicant to read this and then present to us at a staff review the point system.
So we were to look back on our point system, which is about 2 years old now, I would think, maybe 3 years?
No,
Has it been longer than that?
Longer than
way longer.
Wow, I think
It was in
longer.
effect before I came here, and I've been here 7.
It was in effect before you got here?
Yes.
Pat Clark.
Pat Clark, he did. I was
Yep.
just wondering.
So I don't know the exact date it
Well, at
was
any rate.
implemented, but it probably,
Just the last 5 years, just like that.
it probably worked, but we've changed our ordinance to make a lot of these reviews staff review
Right.
and make it less cumbersome for applicants and an easier process, which is working. This is just making it.
Well, so, but if we look back over the years now, then we have even more years to look back on. If we went and looked at the projects that we approved 5, 6 years ago with this point system, would we find functioning rain gardens?
Yes.
We would, okay.
Yes. We've done, the ones we've done recently, like Panther Run Marina, they have installed theirs. I think, I'm trying to remember if, when we did some revisions to David Greep's, the water sports, if we used some of the points there, I think we did.
Yep.
So I'd say yes, that you would find rain gardens, you would find some detention wet ponds. And, you know, Jim's just gone through this and cleaned it up. I read through his changes, they seem to work. We'll work on them, you know, we'll continue to work on them
Yeah,
before
no,
we
it
present
was
it.
more of a curious.
But I think it's good.
I don't think we ever went back and looked at it after we changed the ordinance to
Yeah,
incorporate.
yeah, and I think it's working. I think it's a good, viable option to come up with stormwater treatment for smaller projects, like if you're just adding a shed to a project and you want to deal with the rainwater coming off the roof, you do line drip edges and maybe a rain garden or a buffer. We've used a lot of buffering on these projects.
Okay.
But like Roshire Road was one that would be a good example of using buffers in the point system. We did Marsonic's Viv's Way, where they did a backlot driveway. I think we reported it to you, and we used the point system there, and it worked well. No, it's working.
Okay.
So
I was a bit more interested in a lot of those things requiring maintenance as to whether or not they're actually being maintained.
well, that's always an issue, whether it's a stormwater phosphorus control that went through an engineer. Maintenance is always an issue. Whether they do it or not, things will start to fail and they'll have to deal with it, but that is always an issue.
Okay. The rate changes, I don't have any problems with. Do you have any?
No.
I think it's fine.
So on to 5.
You didn't change the points, right? That 40 points is in red.
No,
but
we
I
just
don't think that
broadened
was-
what they encompass.
Yeah, okay. Yep, 1-5.
5 is one that we haven't really worked on yet, but it's something that we wanted to bring up. There's some discrepancies in the ordinance on percent of lot coverage. In the shoreline zone, it's 15%. In the land use ordinance, it's 15% for all lots, except in the commercial zone, which they don't consider lot coverage. But when you look at the appeals board and what their authority is, it gives them the authority to increase the amount of lot coverage depending on if they were doing, like, for instance, an accessory apartment. So we want to go through that, clean it up, and make it more consistent with surrounding towns. Surrounding towns, many of the towns have a 20% lot coverage in rural zones. We're still at 15%. And if you have a small lot, that's not much. Considering you got a driveway that counts as impervious, the buildings count as impervious. So it's something I think that we should look at. And the other thing that's in our ordinance, which never came up until recently, is we have a section in the land use ordinance that requires us to it only allows one principal dwelling per lot. The DEP for shoreline zoning in the Chapter 1000 guidelines allows 2 principal dwellings. If you have twice the acreage, twice the waterfront requirement, DEP is good. So we had an example where we had somebody apply for what they called an accessory structure. It was roughly a 5,000 square foot guest house. The principal structure was 2,500 square feet. Jim and I directed as staff to they did a staff review to do an extension of the road to get the road frontage and split out a separate lot, because we read in the ordinance that you're only allowed one principal structure.
Right.
They hired an attorney and argued that it was an accessory structure. It was subordinate to the principal dwelling. It was going to be used as a guest house. Pretty good argument. There's some gray area there. I think we ought to look at, if we're going to keep that language of one principal dwelling per lot, we need to expand on the definition of what a principal structure is and then what an accessory structure is. We define it differently in the land use ordinance and the shoreline zoning ordinance. It's different. And it says subordinate and incidental to are the words they use. But I think we ought to get a little bit more specific.
Okay. That's
So it's
very good.
something that Jim and I can work on with Stephanie's help, and maybe kind of just making that a little clearer so that we don't have appeals and confusion over what's a principal structure and an accessory structure.
You may want, I think it's good, I think it makes sense. But you might want to not put a lot of effort into that one until we can talk to the whole board about that.
Absolutely,
Because that's gonna be something
absolutely.
that,
And I'll be more clear as to what sections of the ordinance apply, so that you can go to those sections in the ordinance and we'll follow it step by step.
okay. Housekeeping items regarding fees? But we've been working on fees here for a while. Have we still got this wrong?
Yeah, we shouldn't charge any. Gosh.
Now, this has gotta be 2 years. It's gotta be 2 years we're working on fees.
Yeah, that's it.
I really don't know exactly what the intent of this is. I think it's a housekeeping cleanup thing.
Okay.
Yes, I think when we made changes, the town attorney made a lot of the changes. I don't know that we looked at them close enough when we adopted them. I think there's just some very
Okay,
minor.
so we're not changing fees,
No,
we're just changing words.
it's a
Okay.
minor cleanup.
All right. And I guess 7 is the same thing.
The first part, it's in our ordinance that appeals must be filed within 30 days.
Right.
I guess there's some law cases that the courts have ruled that 45 days is the correct number of days to file an appeal. So we probably want to be in line with what the courts are
Okay.
leaning. And then the other one is another. Planning Board has an appeal right now.
Yeah, is that this
So,
memo?
so this is what that memo is about.
Okay.
And in that memo, you're gonna read that Jim Kakafikis is recommending that we change our ordinance so that it specifically instructs the appeals board how to handle a planning board appeal. It talks about administrative appeals of the code officer for a decision that I make.
Right.
It talks about where you go to do that. You go to the appeals board.
Yeah.
It's silent on where you go for,
But we tell
Planning
everyone
board.
to go to Superior Court, don't we?
but it's not in our ordinance. It doesn't say that.
But you mean they didn't listen to me?
No.
It says it right
Well,
there.
for
Yeah.
shoreline zoning rules. they
So
have to-
there's some conflict in our ordinance, and right now they're trying to decide, the appeals board, how to look at the appeal. Do they do a de novo review, which is they look at everything that you looked at, so all the information
Yeah.
that was presented to you will be represented on all the items that are appealed. That's called a de novo appeal. Or should we be sending them directly to Superior Court? The courts are wishy-washy on this. There's case law on each side some saying, yeah, you should be able to go to the town and appeal it and exhaust all your resources before you go to Superior Court. And then there's law that says just the opposite, you should go to Superior Court. There's been cases on both sides. So Jim's looking that we should look at this and come up with a solution.
Okay,
Is that for shoreline zoning, or is that?
It's
all-
both, shoreline zoning and land use.
Hmm.
It's not clear as to where, I think it's clearer in the land use ordinance than it is in
I
shoreline
thought all
zoning.
land use had to go to a zoning board first, but I don't, you know better than me.
Well, no, actually on this one, I'm pretty confused, like, the appeals board and our town attorneys. I mean, it's one of these things that the courts haven't been clear, so nobody can give you a definite, Jim Kakafigis, if you read his memo,
I did,
is
yeah.
really not really clear as to
No.
which way the board should look at this.
Right.
So I think it's a discussion that we need to have, and maybe what we need to do on that one, Bob, maybe having more than a memo from the town attorneys. Maybe we need to have them present for that discussion at some point.
yeah,
But we can give you more background on that one for the next meeting.
all right. And then I guess Mary needs to look at bullet 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That says appeals from adverse decisions must be filed with the appropriate appeals board of Superior Court or otherwise provided by law within 30 days.
Correct.
So that should be then, you're saying included in an ordinance somewhere?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, and changing 30 to 45.
Correct.
Okay.
If we make those changes. But they're recommending that.
Yeah, I won't think the appeals board would want to go through, this is the Fry Island, right, the parking lot?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think they would want to go through that.
It's a real nightmare.
Probably they
What was that, 10 years we worked on that, right? Probably what?
It was 3.
Yeah, I know.
And maybe the appeals will be on it for. who
So what
knows?
is the appeal? Can you say what it is?
I don't know if I have, I can tell you they've appealed some of your decisions, like on safety, that the abutters have been affected financially. There's different things in the appeal.
So the appeal is the appeal is not.
Is from abutters
From abutters to stop the,
to stop the
to stop
project.
the project, okay.
And they have an attorney.
Yep.
The appeals board, the last 2 meetings we've had 4 attorneys there.
Is it the Friends of Raymond Cape group, or is it?
No, it's another group.
Another group, okay.
And
Raymond
part
Cape
of it
and
is,
Fry Island people. Is that right?
what's that?
Some of the people are Fry Island people?
Yeah, some of the
That
people
are
that are
involved
against
in
it are
this.
from Fry Island.
Yeah.
And I think, it's tough for the zoning board to review, they don't have the expertise the planning board does at looking at performance standards and criteria of the land
'cause they
use
don't
and the
do
show.
that.
Because they don't do that,
Right.
they don't have the experience.
No.
So it's kind of, maybe this should go to Superior Court. I mean, I don't know, it's a discussion that we have to have. Plan of Communications, he's not here.
We're not working on these yet. All right, I guess that's it. Anything else?
Move
No,
to
I think-
adjourn.
Done.